Three scary through horror stories from remote locations. Part 1. Hey everyone, welcome back. If you're new here, hello, good to have you, and I'm sorry in advance for nothing in particular. Go ahead and get comfortable. Pull the blanket up a little. Turn the lights down low, or off entirely if you're feeling brave, which, given that we're about to talk about remote locations and what happens in them, is maybe a bold choice on your part, but I respect it. Tonight we are drifting somewhere far from the nearest coffee shop, far from cell service, far from anyone who might hear you if things went sideways, which, as we'll find out, is sort of the whole problem with remote locations. They are beautiful and vast and quiet in that specific way that starts to feel less peaceful and more loaded the longer you sit in it. We have 3 stories tonight, all of them true, all of them documented, in police reports, in local news archives, in the kind of small-town records that nobody digitizes because the county doesn't have the budget for it, and honestly because some things are easier to leave in a filing cabinet in a building nobody visits. These are stories from the edges of the map, from places where the nearest neighbor is a 45-minute drive and the road isn't always plowed in winter, places where people go to be left alone, and occasionally something goes wrong with that arrangement. We'll start in Alaska, because of course we will. Alaska has a way of making everything feel smaller. You, specifically. Your plans. Your competence. The whole idea that you have any meaningful control over your circumstances. The state is enormous, roughly twice the size of Texas, for reference. And the human population is around 730,000 people, most of whom are clustered in Anchorage and a handful of other cities. Which means that enormous stretches of that enormous state contain almost nobody. That ratio, land to people, is the backdrop for everything that happens in remote Alaska. When something goes wrong out there, help is not close. Help is, in many cases, a float plane away, and the float plane can't come if the weather is bad. And in Alaska, the weather is frequently bad. This first story comes from a region along the western interior of Alaska, in a community so small that most maps don't bother labeling it. We'll call it what locals called it, which was simply the settlement, because that's roughly what it was. A cluster of maybe a dozen homes, a fuel depot, a small general store that was also the post office, and a community building that doubled as a church on Sundays and a meeting hall the rest of the time. The families there had mostly been there for generations. Some were indigenous Alaskan families who had lived on that land for far longer than the settlement had formally existed. Others were homesteaders, descendants of people who had come out in the 40s and 50s, filed their land claims, and built lives in a place specifically because it was hard to reach. That combination of deep roots and deliberate isolation is common in places like this. It also means that when something strange starts to happen, there isn't always an outside reference point. No one to call who can say, yes, that's unusual, because everything is unusual. Out there, by most people's standards. The events I'm going to describe began in the autumn, late September, when the days were already shortening fast and the temperature was dropping toward what would eventually become a long, dark winter. A man we'll call Raymond, because that was, in fact, his name, it appears in the documentation, had been living at the settlement for about 3 years. He'd come originally from Fairbanks, which is a city technically, though calling Fairbanks a city is doing a fair amount of work with that word. He'd moved to the settlement after a divorce, or so people said. He was quiet. He was polite when he needed to be. He kept largely to himself, which nobody found strange because keeping to yourself is fairly standard practice in places like this. In late September, Raymond stopped coming to the store. Now, in a city, that means nothing. In a settlement of 12 homes, where everyone passes through the store at least once a week because it's the only place to get anything, it gets noticed after about 10 days. The woman who ran the store, we'll call her Martha, because that was her name too. The documentation is unusually consistent on first names. Mentioned it to her husband. Her husband mentioned it to one of the other men in the settlement. That man drove out to Raymond's place, which was about 4 miles from the main cluster of buildings, down a dirt track that was already starting to ice over at the edges in the mornings. He knocked on the door. The door was unlocked. Raymond was inside. He was sitting in a chair by the window, facing outward, and he was fine, physically. He was breathing. He was warm. He hadn't had a medical emergency. He was just sitting there. And when the neighbor came in and asked if everything was all right, Raymond said yes, everything was fine. He'd just been watching. Watching what? The neighbor asked. Raymond pointed out the window. The window looked out onto the tree line, which was maybe 60 yards from the house. Spruce trees mostly, dense and dark, and the kind of trees that don't let much light through, even in summer and in autumn. They're just a dark wall. Raymond said he'd been watching the trees because something had been coming out of them at night. Something that walked on two legs but moved wrong. He said he'd first seen it about 2 weeks prior, and that it came every night. Around the same time, around 2 in the morning, he thought, though he'd stopped checking the clock. It would come out to the edge of the tree line, stand there for a while, and then go back in. He hadn't gone outside to investigate. He hadn't called anyone. He hadn't slept much. The neighbor, to his credit, did not immediately dismiss this. He asked Raymond to describe what he saw more specifically. Raymond said it was hard to describe. It was dark, and he only had the light from inside the house, which wasn't much. He said it was tall. He said the way it stood was wrong, not quite how a person stands. He said it made him not want to go outside, and that was the main thing, really, that feeling. He'd been living on canned food and what was left in the house for 2 weeks. The neighbor went home and told his wife. His wife told Martha. Martha mentioned it to 2 other families. By the next day, most of the settlement had heard some version of it, and that version had already drifted, as stories do, away from what Raymond had actually said and towards something more specific and more frightening. A few of the men decided they'd go out to Raymond's place the following night and watch, not to confront anything, just to see, because that's what you do in places like this. You don't call the authorities for something like this, partly because the nearest authority is very far away, and partly because, what are you going to say? You investigate yourself, quietly, and you make a decision from there. They went out. 4 men, including the original neighbor, a man named Carl, a teenager named Danny who'd insisted on coming and been allowed to, and an older man who had lived in the settlement the longest, a man in his late 60s who had been born there and whose family had been in that area for 3 generations. We'll call him Walter. They sat in Raymond's house with the lights off. Raymond sat in his chair because he said that was where he'd been each night, and he didn't want to change anything. The other 4 found spots around the room. They waited. At some point after midnight, the accounts differ slightly on the exact time, Raymond said quietly, "There." They looked. At the tree line, barely visible in the ambient darkness, there was something standing. Now, here is where the story does what remote location stories always do, which is become frustratingly imprecise at exactly the moment you want precision. Because what happened next is described differently by each of the 5 people present, and none of those descriptions is particularly satisfying. Carl said it was a person. A large person maybe, or someone wearing something bulky, standing very still. He said his first thought was that someone was out there for a legitimate reason, a hunter maybe, who'd gotten turned around and was trying to figure out where he was. Danny said it wasn't a person. He was the most emphatic about this. He said the proportions were off. The way it held itself was off. He said watching it made him feel something he described as like the feeling before you throw up, a full-body wrongness that he couldn't put into words better than that. Walter, the oldest man, said nothing during the encounter. When asked about it afterward, he said simply that it was something that lived in the forest, and that it was not new. He said there were older words for things like this, in the language his family had spoken before English, and that those words existed for a reason, and that the reason was that people had been seeing things like this for a very long time. He was not alarmed exactly. He was respectful. Those are different things. Raymond said it was the same as every other night. It stood there. It went back into the trees. After it went back in, nobody said anything for a long time. Then Carl said, well, that was something. They didn't go outside that night. In the weeks that followed, Raymond did start coming to the store again. He started sleeping again, or said he was. He told Martha that the thing had stopped coming after that night, after the night all 5 of them had watched it, as if being collectively witnessed had been enough, as if it had needed something from the watching and gotten it and moved on. Whether you take that literally or not is up to you. I find it interesting either way, the idea that attention, collective human attention, might change something, or that coincidences align in patterns we find meaningful because we are pattern-finding creatures, even in the dark, especially in the dark. The settlement still exists, by the way, or it did, as of the last records I could find. A little smaller now than it was, the way most very small Alaskan communities are, a little smaller each decade as the young people leave for cities and the old people get older. Raymond, as far as anyone documented, lived there until at least the early 2000s, and then is it mentioned again, which could mean anything or nothing. The tree line is still there. Part 2. The House at the End of the Road, Story 2. Let's drift now, a little south and a lot east. This next story comes from Appalachia, specifically from a county in West Virginia that I'm going to decline to name precisely, not because there's anything legally sensitive here, but because the family at the center of this story still has descendants in the area, and these are small communities, and people remember. West Virginia is in many ways a state defined by its geography. It's all ridges and hollows. A hollow being the local term for those narrow valleys tucked between mountain ridges, cut by streams, often only reachable by one road that follows the water. Hollows can be strikingly beautiful and, in the same breath, profoundly isolating. Some of them effectively function as their own micro-communities, separate from the towns technically nearest to them by topography more than by any great distance. The family in this story had lived in one of those hollows for, well, a long time. Long enough that the older locals sometimes referred to the hollow by their surname, the way places acquire names organically over generations of association. Now, I want to be careful here, because this story involves something that is simultaneously a historical reality and a topic that has been handled badly in popular culture, which is to say, isolated communities and inbreeding and what happens to bloodlines over generations when the gene pool is very limited and there are cultural and geographic barriers to marrying outside it. This is not a fictional horror trope. This happened historically in isolated communities across Appalachia, across remote European villages, across countless places worldwide where people were cut off for long enough that the options narrowed. The consequences were real and they were often quiet, and they accumulated slowly over time in ways that the people living through them sometimes couldn't fully see. The family in the hollow had been there since before the Civil War. At their peak, in the early 20th century, there were perhaps 40 or 50 people in the hollow who were part of the extended family in one way or another. They farmed. They kept pigs and chickens. They had a relationship with the nearest town that was functional but limited. They came in for things they couldn't produce themselves, for medicine occasionally, for church sometimes, and then they went back. By the 1960s, when the events I'm going to describe were documented by a social worker named, according to the records, Helen Marsh, the family had shrunk to about 15 people across 3 households. And they had been marrying within their own extended family for generations. Helen was sent out to the hollow as part of a broader state program to assess living conditions in isolated rural communities. This was a real initiative in several Appalachian states in the 60s, partly genuine social welfare, partly the kind of paternalistic governmental reach that looks uncomfortable in retrospect, partly a response to specific concerns that had been raised by a county health official who had treated some of the family members and was worried about what he was seeing. Helen drove as far as she could drive, which was to the mouth of the hollow, and then she walked. The road into the hollow proper was not passable by most vehicles. It was a track, really, muddy in spring, frozen in winter, rutted year-round. She wrote about this walk in her report, and her report is remarkable for its flatness. She was clearly a person who wrote the way she was trained to write, which was factually and without editorializing, and so her descriptions of what she found have this quality of being quietly devastating without seeming to intend devastation. She noted the condition of the 3 houses, 2 of which were functional, 1 of which was in significant disrepair. She noted the children she encountered. There were 7 children under the age of 14, and she documented physical observations about each of them with the careful, clinical language of her profession. Several of the children had what she described as evident developmental delays. One child, a boy of about 8, could not speak. One of the girls, around 10, had significant difficulty with fine motor tasks. Helen noted, without comment, that 2 of the adults in the household she visited had the same last name before marriage that they had after it. She was there for 2 days. She stayed in the more intact of the 2 occupied houses, in a room that was clean and was offered to her with a quiet hospitality that she noted specifically in her report. The family was not hostile. They were, she wrote, courteous and, in their way, welcoming. They answered her questions. They showed her what she asked to see. They did not seem to fully understand what the purpose of her visit was, or perhaps they understood and had decided to receive it with dignity regardless. What Helen documented over those 2 days was not dramatic. That's the thing about this kind of story. There's no single moment of horror. There's just the slow accumulation of details that add up to something you can't unfeel once you've added it. She documented a family that had closed itself off, gradually, over generations, until the closing had become the condition. The children born in the hollow had mostly never left it. The adults described the hollow with a complete absence of desire for anything beyond it, not with the passion of people who'd chosen this life consciously, but with the flat acceptance of people for whom other options had simply never been legible. One of the older women, a woman in her 60s who was identified in the report only as the matriarch, told Helen that the hollow was all there was, that everything beyond it was noise. She said this pleasantly. She was sitting on the porch of the Better House shelling beans, and she said it the way you might describe the weather. Helen left after 2 days, filed her report, and recommended a range of interventions: educational access for the children, medical evaluations, a follow-up visit within 6 months. The follow-up visit never happened. The program that funded Helen's visit was cut before the follow-up could be scheduled. This was also documented, in a different file, in a different part of the county records, the kind of bureaucratic continuity failure that is its own sort of quiet horror. As far as the records show, nothing changed in the hollow. The family continued, as it had continued. By the 80s, there were fewer people there. The younger generation had, in some cases, found their way out, particularly after a road improvement project made the hollow more accessible. By the 90s, the hollow was largely empty. The last holdout, an elderly man, died sometime in the early 2000s, and the houses reverted eventually to the forest in the way that abandoned structures in wet climates always do. Slowly, then all at once. But Helen's report survives. And it survives because she was the kind of person who kept her files, apparently, and because a historian studying Appalachian social welfare programs in the late 90s came across it in a county archive and recognized it for what it was: a quiet, careful document of what isolation does, over time, to people and to bloodlines and to the idea of what the world contains. There's a passage near the end of Helen's report that I keep coming back to. She writes, in her flat professional way, that upon leaving the hollow and returning to her car, she sat for several minutes before starting the engine. She doesn't say why. She doesn't editorialize. She simply notes it, as a fact, the way she notes everything else. She sat for several minutes. I think about what she might have been sitting with. Part 3. The road that isn't on the map. Story 3 begins. Our third and final story for tonight takes us to rural Minnesota. Specifically to a stretch of country in the northern part of the state near the Canadian border, where the landscape is all boreal forest and frozen lakes and roads that go for 20 miles between anything you'd call a landmark. This story is more recent. It comes from the late 1990s, and it is documented not through official records, but through something arguably more intimate. A series of letters and journal entries left by a woman named Diane, who was, at the time of the events, 31 years old and living alone in a house she'd inherited from her grandmother, 6 miles from the nearest town, which was itself a town of perhaps 400 people. Diane had moved there deliberately. She was, by her own account in the early journal entries, someone who had grown up in the Twin Cities and had found city life, as she put it, too loud in a way that wasn't about volume. She'd inherited the house when her grandmother died. She'd taken it as a sign. She'd moved up north, and she'd been happy there, genuinely happy, for about 18 months before the summer that the journal really starts to get strange. I want to be clear about something before I go further. Diane's account is one person's account, filtered through her own perceptions and written in a mode, personal journaling, that is not designed to be objective. What she wrote is what she experienced. Whether the experiences were entirely as she perceived them is a separate question, and one I'm not going to answer for you because I don't know. What I can tell you is that her account is internally consistent. It's specific in the kinds of ways that fabricated accounts usually aren't, and several of the things she described were later corroborated, partially, by other people. The summer in question was 1997. Diane had been making modest improvements to the house, the roof, some of the plumbing, the wood stove. She'd set up a garden. She'd gotten a dog, a large mixed breed named, according to the journals, Oliver, who apparently had opinions about everything and was described with great affection throughout the earlier entries. In June of that year, Oliver started refusing to go to one part of the property. The property was about 12 acres, which in that part of Minnesota is not unusual. Most of the old homestead properties out there are at least that size. The part Oliver refused to approach was the northeast corner, which was mostly forest old-growth spruce and tamarack, with a boggy depression at the very corner of the property line, where a small creek fed into the ground, rather than continuing anywhere visible. Diane noted this first as an odd behavior, not alarming. Dogs are strange. Dogs have opinions. She didn't push it. She let Oliver avoid the northeast corner and moved on. In July, she started noticing the smell. It's hard to describe the smell from her descriptions, which is itself a thing about smells. They resist language more than almost any other sensation. She wrote about it in 3 separate entries, trying to pin it down differently each time. In the first entry, she said it was like something wet and organic and wrong. In the second entry, she said it reminded her of the smell inside old buildings, that specific damp and rot and something else, something almost animal. In the third entry, she said it was the smell of a place that things had died in for a long time. The smell came and went. It was strongest near the northeast corner, but it drifted, particularly in the evenings. She couldn't identify a source. She checked the bog. There was nothing visible, no carcass, no unusual animal activity, nothing obvious. The bog was just a bog, boggy and dark and, she noted, very quiet. Even for the forest, which was generally quiet, the bog had a specific quality of silence that she described as attentive, as if the silence wasn't just the absence of sound, but something that was actively listening, which is the kind of thing you write in a private journal at night in a house 6 miles from anyone, when you're starting to feel uneasy. I'm not saying there was a listening silence. I'm saying that the feeling of a listening silence is a real human experience with real effects on the person having it. In August, things shifted. Diane had a neighbor, the word neighbor doing significant work there, as the man in question lived about 2 miles away, named Gary. Gary was in his 50s, had lived in that area his whole life, and had been sporadically helpful to Diane since she moved in. He plowed her driveway in winter. He'd helped her with the roof. He was not, by Diane's description, a man given to storytelling or speculation. He was practical and brief, and the kind of person who fixes things and doesn't discuss them much. Gary stopped by in early August. He was checking on her, which wasn't unusual. While he was there, Diane mentioned the smell, because she was looking for a practical explanation, and Gary seemed like a person who might have one. Gary's response was not what she expected. He got quiet, she wrote. Not uncomfortable quiet, but careful quiet, like he was deciding something. Benny asked her exactly where the smell was strongest, and she described the northeast corner and the bog, and Gary nodded in a way that she described as not surprised. He told her that there had been something in that corner of the property for as long as anyone he knew could remember. He didn't characterize it further than that, just something. He said his own father had mentioned it. He said the family that had owned the land before Diane's grandmother had mentioned it too, going back to the earliest settlers in the area. It was not a new thing. It had always been there, or something like it had always been there. He said the main thing was not to spend time near the bog at night. Diane asked him why. Gary thought about it for a moment and then said simply that he didn't know exactly. He just knew that people who spent time near it at night had a tendency to come back, changed in small ways. Not dramatically, just off a little, like a compass that's been near a magnet. Still works mostly. Just doesn't point quite right anymore. He said this in a very matter-of-fact way, apparently. Diane wrote that it was the most unsettling thing anyone had ever said to her specifically because of how matter-of-fact it was. Gary finished his coffee, helped her fix a loose board on the porch, and drove home. He didn't bring it up again. Diane did not go near the bog at night. She didn't go near it much during the day either, though she told herself that was just common sense, given the terrain. Bogs are treacherous, the ground isn't what it looks like, it's easy to get turned around. But Oliver still refused to go anywhere near the northeast corner, and Oliver, she wrote, had better instincts than she did, and she had decided to trust them. The smell faded in September, when the first cool nights came in and the air changed. By October, she couldn't smell it at all. The winter came hard and early that year, and buried everything under 2 feet of snow and then ice. She stayed through the winter. She wrote about the winter with something close to contentment, actually. The enforced stillness of it, the way the cold simplified everything, the sound of the wood stove, Oliver sleeping at her feet. The northeast corner was just a white absence in the snow, the bog frozen solid and covered over and invisible. In the spring, the smell came back, not as strong, not as constant. But it came back, And when he came back, Diane wrote something in her journal that I find harder to set aside than any of the other entries. She wrote, "I went to look at the bog today, in the afternoon, in full sun. I stood at the edge of the trees and looked at it. I was there for maybe 10 minutes. When I walked back to the house, Oliver came out to meet me the way he always does, and he stopped about 4 feet away from me and wouldn't come any closer. He stood there looking at me with his ears flat, and he wouldn't come. I called him, and he backed up. I've had Oliver for 2 years, and he has never done this. I went inside and washed my face and hands and changed my clothes and went back outside. And he came to me then, and I held him for a long time, and I didn't go back to the northeast corner again." She left that summer. She sold the property the following spring and moved back south, though not to the cities, to a small town in central Minnesota she mentioned in a later letter to a friend, small but connected, close enough to things. She wrote one more journal entry after the sale went through. It was short. She wrote that she missed the house, and she missed the quiet, and she did not miss the northeast corner, and that she thought some places carry things in them the way wood carries the memory of fire, invisibly, mostly dormantly, but there, and warm to the right kind of touch. That's where the journal ends. Part 4, What Remains, closing, and full wind down, and now we let the story settle. That's the thing about true accounts from remote places. They don't resolve, usually. They don't have clean endings. The thing at the tree line went back into the trees, and the trees are still there. The hollow still has its foundations, somewhere under decades of ivy and fallen branches. The bog in northern Minnesota is still a bog, frozen half the year, and whoever lives near it now, if anyone does, may or may not have found the edges of what Gary described. Remote places are, by definition, places where human certainty thins out. We have built, over the centuries, very sophisticated explanations for things. We have science which is genuinely remarkable and genuinely useful, and which I have nothing but respect for. We have psychology, which has given us very good language for the effects of isolation on the human mind, the way the brain, deprived of sufficient social input and sufficient light and sufficient variation, starts to generate meaning in the empty spaces, starts to see patterns, starts to feel watched. All of that is true, and I believe all of it. And also, there are places on this earth that are old enough and quiet enough and far enough from the nearest street light that they feel like they belong to a different set of rules, where the explanations we carry with us from cities and suburbs feel like they were made for a different context. Not wrong, exactly. Just insufficient, like trying to use a city map in a forest. The people in tonight's stories, Raymond, watching the tree line from his chair, not sleeping, not quite frightened, but not right either. Helen, sitting in her car before she started the engine, holding whatever she'd accumulated in 2 days in the hollow. Diane, standing at the edge of the bog in full afternoon sunlight, and then standing outside the house afterward with her dog 4 feet away and his ears flat. They were all, in their own ways, at the edge of something. The edge of what their available frameworks could account for. That's a particular kind of loneliness. Being at the edge of your own understanding, in a place where there's no one close enough to check with. What I find myself thinking about when I think about remote locations and the things that happen in them is not the dramatic version of these stories, not the monster at the tree line version, not the found footage version. What I think about is the quieter version, which is this. There are places where humans are not the primary fact, where we are the visitors, even when we have lived there for generations, where the land has a quality that predates us and will outlast us, and that quality does not care about us one way or another, but it is legible, faintly, to the parts of us that are older than cities. The parts that know to go inside when something feels wrong, the parts that trust the dog, the parts that sit in the car for a few minutes before starting the engine, those parts of us are not irrational. They are the collected wisdom of an enormous amount of time. Every generation of every ancestor you have, stretching back past agriculture, past language as we know it, past any version of civilization. They all survived long enough to produce the next generation, in part because they listened to those parts. The parts that said, wait. The parts that said, not yet. The parts that said something is here, and I cannot tell you what it is, but it is here, and I am going inside now. That instinct didn't go anywhere when we built the cities. It just got quieter most of the time. There's a lot of noise to compete with. In remote places, the noise goes away. And sometimes what you can hear in the quiet is just wind and water and the ordinary sounds of the natural world. And sometimes, rarely at 2 in the morning, looking out a window at a dark tree line, it is something else. Or the brain creates the feeling of something else, which for the person sitting in the chair is not a meaningful distinction. Raymond didn't go back to his tree line, or if he did, he didn't report it. The settlement held together for another few decades, slowly diminishing in the way that very small, remote communities do. The hollows of West Virginia have mostly been reconnected to the wider world now, for better and for worse. The isolation that produced what Helen documented is harder to maintain than it was when she walked in with her social worker's clipboard. The bog in northern Minnesota is still just a bog to anyone who doesn't know the story, and maybe it's still just a bog to anyone who does. These places exist in the margins of the legible world, not fully on the map, not fully off it. And tonight, wherever you are, warm, I hope, and horizontal, and somewhere between waking and not, you are very far from all of them. The nearest remote wilderness is probably quite far away. The nearest tree line with something standing at it is somewhere you are not. The nearest hollow is somewhere you haven't been and may never go. The nearest bog with a history is in a different county probably, or a different state, or a different country, and it's frozen anyway this time of year and nothing is moving there tonight. You are, by every measure, somewhere that is not remote. You are connected, to the internet at least, which is something which is actually a remarkable thing when you think about it, this invisible web of signal and infrastructure that makes it so that voices can travel anywhere, even to very quiet rooms at very late hours, and speak into the dark and be heard. So, here is the voice traveling to your quiet room. You can close your eyes. There is nothing at the tree line. There is nothing at the edge of the bog. The hollow is empty, has been empty for decades, and the forest is doing what forests do, which is grow back, slowly, over everything, in the patient and indifferent way of things that have all the time in the world. Oliver is fine. Oliver is in a house somewhere in central Minnesota, where his descendants are, and they are warm and fed and sleeping the way dogs sleep, fully, completely, with an uncomplicated commitment to rest that is genuinely admirable. Let's go to sleep. The sounds you hear are just the ordinary sounds of wherever you are. The shadows are not watching, the remote places are far away. And this voice, which has been keeping you company for 30 minutes or so, is going to go quiet now, and leave you to the perfectly ordinary, perfectly safe, perfectly uneventful night ahead. Sleep well.